Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to try and piece together the worldview of a really prominent, and I think it's fair to say, often controversial figure in online commentary, Andrew Wilson.
And our mission here is to really synthesize everything, all the interviews, the debates, the personal stories, to get at what's driving him. Not just what he says, but why.
Right. I mean, you might know him as one of the top super chat earners out there.
For sure. But his story, it's just so improbable. We're talking about a guy who went from being a robotics mechanic to, well, this. And a lot of his public life seems to be defined by what he himself calls a continuous state of rage.
That rage is what's so fascinating. We have a ton to unpack here, from his philosophy on, knowing what you know, to a personal tragedy that really shaped him. We want to give you that full picture. So let's start with just how unlikely his rise was.
It was completely accidental. He's very clear that he never, ever intended to be an entertainer or some kind of personality.
So what happened?
It was really a slow burn during the COVID lockdowns. He started out just arguing, constantly, with progressives on Facebook.
We've all been there.
Right. But then he took it a step further and started crashing their live video panels. It was only after doing that for a while that he eventually moved over to YouTube.
So he's a robotics mechanic, a guy who deals with concrete systems, who just found this one intellectual itch he could not stop scratching.
Exactly. This wasn't about ambition. He'd say it was about intellectual compulsion. And that, leads you right back to his early life, which is also full of contradictions.
Yeah, he talks about being a delinquent, right?
Yeah.
Cutting school all the time.
All the time. Total rebellion. But at the same time, he was, in his words, highly gifted in reading and comprehension. He makes that distinction himself. He says, he was never great at math.
But processing complex information, synthesizing it, that was his thing.
That was his core skill. It became his primary weapon, intellectually speaking.
But where did he learn how to aim that weapon? I mean, it's one thing to be smart, but another to be so directed.
Right, and he says that lesson, the most important one, came from his father, a Christian former Air Force vet who had multiple sclerosis.
And what was that lesson?
It was all about methodology. It was about how to think.
How to think. What does that even mean in practice?
Well, for him, it meant learning early on that most people, and this is the core of it, they don't have any real justification for their beliefs. They're just repeating talking points.
So the key question wasn't what to believe.
No. The constant question his father drilled into him was, how do you actually know that?
That makes so much sense. That skepticism, that demand for justification, that's basically the blueprint for his entire debate style today.
It is. And maybe you can see his rage as just this intense frustration when he runs into people who can't answer that one basic question.
That frustration of, intellectual rigor hitting a brick wall of laziness.
Exactly. But it's important to note, this path wasn't a straight line for him. He talks about a 7-year period in his early 20s that he calls disastrous.
He just walked away from all of it.
Completely. He became, a delinquent, nihilistic, totally focused on selfish, materialistic stuff.
Yeah.
A complete rejection of his father's teachings, of any kind of conservative or Christian foundation.
So what brought him back? That's a critical turning point.
It is. And it wasn't some sudden, flash of theological insight. It was a person.
His wife?
His now wife, yeah. He met her online. They've been together for 18 years. And he credits her for having, in his words, that kind of faith in you. That belief from her is what helped him realize that life was not all about me.
Okay, so let's connect that personal story. The demand for justification, the return to a life of duty, to his core intellectual framework. Because the hammer he uses in every debate is this idea of epistemic justification.
Right, and we should probably unpack that term a little.
Please.
At its simplest, it's just the study of how we know what we know. Our beliefs actually justified by logic or evidence. Wilson's starting point is that logic has rules. And to find truth, you have to get rid of your assumptions, your presuppositions.
And he uses a really provocative example to show this weakness in his opponents. The one about incest between twin brothers.
Yes, it's designed to be jarring. His argument is that, logically, you can use data to show potential negative outcomes.
Yeah.
But ethically, he argues that atheists or the secular left don't have a spiritual, a non-material value system to ground the judgment of why it's just plain wrong.
They can't provide that ultimate justification.
For him, that failure is the single biggest weakness of progressive thinking. It's an inability to justify absolute moral lines.
Which makes politics less about, say, tax policy and more like a holy war for control. And that plugs right into his view on power.
It's completely uncompromising. He sees it as a race for power. He says, quote, if Christians aren't in charge, somebody else is going to be in charge of them.
So for him, Christians need to govern using Christian ethics because if they don't, that power vacuum will be filled by something else, something he sees as inferior.
And his big frustration is that he believes Christians have been tricked into giving up that power, thinking there's some virtue in being neutral.
And this is where we get to the core of his public persona, that rage. It isn't just for the left. It's for the people he calls sewing circle Christians.
Yes. This is where it gets really sharp. He defines them as people on the right who just virtue signal constantly. They endlessly criticize the people who are actually willing to get into the mud, into the ugly, mean, and brutal world of political debate.
So they're sniping from the sidelines.
They're sniping from the sidelines, and in his view, they're condemning the very tactics needed to win a cultural war.
So he sees their criticism as actually helping the other side. His challenge to them is absolutely brutal. It's basically...
He says, show me how it's done. Show me the polite way to win this fight. And if you can't, shut your mouth and don't criticize.
So let's apply this framework. How does he use it on specific issues? Starting with progressives themselves. He calls them lunatics of the world.
Yes, and he says they rule from feelings, suicidal empathy. His argument is that when you govern based on pure emotion instead of fixed principles, either logical or ethical, you get chaos.
He connects this directly to COVID, right?
Directly. He argues that things like mandatory vaccines, mask mandates, the lockdowns, that progressives literally created a fascist state. And for him, that is the ultimate example of what happens when a group without epistemic justification gets power. All while, hypocritically calling everyone else fascists.
Okay, turning to immigration. His framework there leads to a very cold, almost cynical calculation. He doesn't see it as just migration.
No. He calls it an invasion and a takeover. He claims that Muslim populations, while disliking progressives, strategically use them as useful idiots to keep the doors open.
And he points out a strange political dynamic there.
He does. He notes that while these communities might vote left on a national level, they often vote against progressive social issues, like LGBTQ rights, on the local level.
So he sees a long game being played, demographic replacement. And the ultimate weapon in this game isn't politics, it's
the woman's womb. He believes the long-term demographic trend is the only thing that really matters in this race for power.
Which brings us to probably his most notorious argument, the IQ and incest debate.
Right. This is where he connected his ideas about Christian ethics directly to, societal outcomes.
He argued that Christian societies do better, partly because of a historical ban on inbreeding.
And he brought data. He cited first-cousin marriage rates in some Muslim nations, like 65% in Pakistan, 50 to 58% in Saudi Arabia, and then he correlated those with lower average IQ scores in those regions.
Like Saudi Arabia at 76, Yemen at 62.9.
The backlash was obviously massive. But for him, the core of the argument wasn't biological, it was ethical. He used that correlation to make a point about power.
His point being that these less sophisticated nations are always appealing to the benevolence of Christian nations for help.
Exactly. And here's the staggering implication he makes. That only Christian values, specifically faith in Jesus Christ, are what's stopping Western civilization from just wiping out weaker nations and taking their stuff.
That's how he frames Christian benevolence, as a practical global stabilizing force.
And he applies this same framework to the Israel-Palestine conflict. His analysis is purely about technology and intellect. He says, look, you have 9 million Jews surrounded by over 100 million Muslims, but the more sophisticated nation wins. It's a blunt observation of military reality based on those perceived differences.
Let's shift to social issues, like feminism. He goes after that with the same demand for logical consistency.
He does. He often targets what he sees as this fundamental contradiction, the demand for many women for both equality and equity, and at the same time, traditional privileges.
And he's criticized conservative influencers for this, too, for promoting what he calls covert feminism.
Right. He says they demand that men act as protectors and providers, these very traditional high-stakes male roles, but they don't give men any virtue or traditional authority in return.
And when he pushes back, asking what men get out of this deal, the defense he usually hears is,
men are just wired to do it. And for him, that's the ultimate cop-out. It's a complete lack of justification. It's just raw entitlement. And that drives his analytical frustration.
Finally, we really have to talk about the personal tragedy that seems to underpin so much of his sense of duty.
We do. He shared the story of his 10-year-old stepson, who he'd raised since he was 2. He was killed in a car accident. The car was stolen and driven by an older teenager.
Just an unimaginable test of faith. He talked about getting advice from a former police sniper who also ran the funeral home.
Yeah. And this man told him, very bluntly, that his wife was never going to be the same ever, but that a new normal would eventually show up.
And Wilson's job in that moment.
His self-prescribed job was to become purely operational. He handled everything, all the logistics, right down to writing individual personal thank you notes to every single person who sent condolences. All of it was to shield his wife from that pain and that act of pure, structured duty in the face of absolute chaos. It tells you a lot about the foundation under his public persona.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. What does this deep dive really tell us about him? It feels like his worldview stands on three pillars. First, that intellectual demand for justification he got from his father.
Right. Second, a political vision for Christian dominance, which he sees as a necessary power structure.
And third, a deep personal resilience that was forged in tragedy.
To tie this all to today, let's go back to that idea of high-stakes trade-offs. Wilson often brings up this hypothetical. Imagine a leader who is protecting sensitive blackmail-level information, maybe like the Epstein files, to maintain political stability.
It's a classic ethical dilemma. It forces a conflict. On one side, you have consequentialism, do what's best for the most people, keep things stable.
And on the other, you have deontology, a focus on absolute moral duty, no matter what the outcome is.
Wilson lands firmly on the side of deontology.
Firmly. He argues that you have to maintain moral consistency, even if protecting those files hypothetically stops a politician from, say, performing another 700,000 abortions. He says the moral duty to protect children and demand justice has to come first, regardless of the political fallout. That consistency is everything.
Which leaves a pretty big question for you, the learner, to think about. Wilson is skeptical about any kind of counter-revolution in America. He thinks people are too passive until problems become in-here problems.
Meaning until it directly affects your life, like you go to the fridge and there's no food.
So, given all the strife he talks about, what specific event, short of a total economic collapse, would be the breaking point? What would it take to bring that crisis in here for the average American family and force them to engage in the race for power he describes? Something for you to mull over this week.